and talking about CDDIS. And Pat, he is our next speaker. The title is Highlights from CDDIS, and as most of you know, he is our IGS Data Center Coordinator. Pat, you should be able to have access to sharing your screen. And we can see everything on our end. We cannot hear you, Pat, though.
Yeah, technical difficulties. I apologize. I'm sitting in the middle of the remnants of Hurricane Ida coming through right now, and it's a little difficult. So give me just a second here.
If not, I can share the presentation on my end, and if that is easier for you, for your bandwidth.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Is it the full screen or is it just
No,
portion?
just the presentation, the PowerPoint work mode.
Yeah, give me a second then. Let me see if I can. Okay, that should be it, right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so sorry for the delay here. You know, I good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever we're at today in the world. I do want to say I'm happy to be here today and have a chance to talk, but I do say that when I was asked to talk and I was told to do some updates on CDDIS, my question to myself was, what do I really talk about? I know there's going to be some people that like me to talk about, you know, what is our quality control process? What is the IT security now with all that going on? What are updates coming up that we have planned over the next 6 months to a year, or, you know, what's happened over the last 6 months to a year that have affected the community? You know, each one of those I could take 15, 30 minutes to talk about. So I've kind of thrown a few items together here from CDDIS that I'm going to talk about. Just touch on recently on each one of those. And then at the end, I'll open up questions, and I have some extra slides and backup if we need to talk about anything. So with that, I do want to talk about, throw up here one slide. I get a lot of comments that, oh, CDDIS, they work for IGS. No, we don't work for IGS. We are a partner with IGS. And we actually work for NASA as part of the NASA Earth Data Archive System, which is NASA's repository for all of the Earth data that is collected from the NASA Earth Observing System. So there's 12 digital or distributed active archive centers that we have across the United States, and CDDIS is just one of them. And in that case, we are really just space geodesy and solid Earth of what we take care of. But I just did want to bring that up there because we're not really a data center. Data center is kind of thrown out there. We're actually an archive system, which has a lot more responsibilities than just taking data and throwing it out there to the public. But I just give it out there so people have a little bit background on what's going on. So as CDDIS is one of those 12 DACs that I just talked about, we're actually unique in the function that we are not assigned a space mission or a space instrument uniquely to us to be able to take the data and then make it available to the public. We actually collect all of our data from our international service partners. So you can see all down along the bottom, all with IGS and the ILRS, the Space Geodesy Project, all of that comes into us. And then all those missions are part of our customer base. And then at the same time, all of those partners that we just got data from are also customers pulling data back from us, either for products or other data that they use in other ways. So we're kind of unique in that we're backwards in how the other DACs work with NASA. But that's an idea of how, you know, just who all we touch in our missions, over 50 missions right now, more than 10 international services like the IGS that we function with and work on an everyday basis. So it gives you an idea of just who all we touch. So a little bit of eye candy here. I think this picture might have already been shown earlier, but this is where we collect our data from all over the world. Right now, more than 1,500 observing stations or sites all over the world. Each one of those sites you see could be anywhere from just a single GNSS technique to maybe 3 GNSS receivers plus an SLR, a VLBI, and a DORIS. So anywhere from 1 to 5 or 6 actual observing sites might be in each one of those places. So that gives us our 1,500 sites. It just gives you a broad idea of where all we collect the data. And we're not exactly looking at just the US for CORS network, which would be NOAA's responsibility, or the CORS network in Australia, which is GA's. It's just what we do is available to the public. So a little bit about CDDIS by the numbers. Right now, we have 244 active data set and products that we work with. Those are in some standardized formats. There are some RINEX, as Nacho just talked about, and there's some SINEX that we deal with. But for the most part, a lot of those data formats that we have to deal with are unique one-offs. And right now, we deal with more than 170 file types within that regard. 200 data providers all over the world, largely non-US, all in very time delivery, multiple data, both in products. So you can start to see the permutations that can come about from all of that. We actually wrote about 3 years ago an AI program to actually watch all that and be able to alert to us what's going on. So like Frank Lemoyne just talked about, how about bandwidth or latencies from someplace like Greenland, which is not uncommon to have 2 to 3 day latencies of getting data from there. It will automatically, after it's been trained, will see that and not notify us until maybe 3 days later. So if you've ever got an email from Rebecca or somebody else, that's where that's actually coming from. It's how we keep track of how much data is coming in and when there is a problem. The archive in itself, we're a little more than 400 million files right now. We're growing by about 55 million per year. That's roughly in the GNSS area, about 96% of that. You can see our file sizes now. We run from anywhere from 10 kilobytes all the way up to huge 300 gigabyte files, which are part of our VLBI provider that we deal with. And right now we're searching or right about 80 terabytes in current size, looking at about 120 at the end of the year. And by 2023, we're expected to be growing by about 200 terabytes a year. Just a little bit on the GNSS side, you can see the numbers that we deal with daily. 35 gigabytes is about what the data is on the GNSS side. Distribution-wise, we're still pretty much about 1.4 to 1.6 billion files per year just for GNSS. It normally comes out to about 400 terabytes of distribution. And we somewhere around 300,000 users, which has been pretty consistent for the last 3 or 4 years. One thing I did want to talk about is that, every file that CDIS gets is opened and quality checked and metadata extracted, depending on what type of file it is or what technique. It could have upwards of more than 50 actions done on each file. So what does that look like on the GNSS side? Well, that means basically about 0.05% every day are rejected, which is about 100 files, which comparing how much we've received is pretty good. Unfortunately, we're still seeing somewhere around 8 to 9% of all files incoming with warnings problems that we have to fix on the fly. That could be anywhere from compression issues with RINEX version 2 on receivers that are still doing compress instead of gzip, or any other things that we can try to correct. We'd like to see that down to where the overall numbers coming into CDDIS are about 98%, but it is right now, we know what it is with a lot of those are the compression issues with RINEX 2. So with that, to go on to the next slide. So I did want to talk a little bit about when I first put out to the community 3 years ago that FTP would be terminated in end of 2020. There was a fair amount of conversation, some of it valid, some of it chicken little pie in the sky type stuff. But now that we've had about 10 months after it's over, I did want to talk about what we saw, lessons learned, and some things that we came about from it so the community can see that we continue to work. The data was still out there. Most people made the change, and there hasn't been a whole lot of difference out there. So in 1 November, we terminated FTP. If you look up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the number of distribution IPs that we typically had per month. Before the termination, we were somewhere around 65,000 distinct IPs per month at CDDIS. When we flicked the switch that month, we dropped to 20,000. Over the next 3 or 4 months, we moved our way back up to where it's pretty much standardized around 35,000 IPs right now. And that new normal that we came to was about 2.8 or 3 million files per day, with considerable variance that it could run up to 5, 8, or even 10 million files per day. But overall, about a 35% decrease in the number of files that went out of us. In addition, the bandwidth dropped about 30%, and we come around to about 1.1 terabytes per day. Now, it sounds like a whole lot, but as we started to dig into the numbers, we found two really reasons why those numbers are at that. And the biggest one is what we call zombies. When we started looking at what was going on after 1 November, we saw a lot, and I mean a lot of what I would call scripts or things that people had written probably years ago, had put on their machine and forgotten all about it. And they were just sitting there running in the background, doing what they were supposed to do, which was to download files and put them where, and that kind of inflated our numbers for the prior year. And once we cut all that off, we kind of really went to the point where the people that we saw are the ones that we're actually using. So I think the numbers that you're seeing now are probably more representative of what was actually happening before the FTP was actually terminated. I won't talk about some of the other things, but the biggest thing that we saw as a problem for us was not to technically moving away from FTP or making available information to how to use HTTPS. It was actually dealing with a lot of people that were on unsupported software. We had lots, and I mean lots, and it consumed a lot of our help desk time dealing with people that were dealing with operating support or OSs that were 5 and even 10 years out past their end of life date, using software that didn't even have the ability to use any type of encryption or SSL or TSL. And it was just a lot of work to do a lot of hand-holding to get people to understand that they couldn't use what they were using because it was just completely unsupported. All of that over now, since we fast forward now to this date, we can see that the overall distribution has pretty much had a 50-50 split. Most of our heavy users, those that do a lot of downloading, pretty much went to the HTTPS route. Those that do less pretty much went to the FTP. So those that are on HTTP, we have less users, but more downloads per user. And on FTPS, we have more users, but less downloads per the user. So it all comes out to about a 50-50%. One thing I did want to talk about that we did find more than that we were expecting was what I call the operational usage of CDDIS in critical infrastructure. I want to put this out to the community that CDDIS is an archive. NASA funds us as an archive. That means we do not have service level agreements to say that we're going to be up at 4 nines or 5 nines per year. So people that use us in an operational aspect really need to understand that and factor that into the risk, because there could be a problem if you are relying on us. And we did run across a few companies that had used CDDIS on the FTP side as business models. So, you know, when we switched and went off, that business model for them went away. So that's just a quick rundown of some of our FTP changes. One of the good things about moving over to a user metric system is now that we actually have metrics to be able to look and tell you how many people and what areas are using the data. As you would expect, right now we have about 9,000 registered users that are using our HTTPS system. Of that, the second largest is the geophysics area, which you would expect, but the largest is actually in another group, one that doesn't take into account any of those other groups that you see along the bottom. And from the CDDIS perspective, that's a good thing because one of our main charters is cross-discipline science. We want to make sure that the data is out there to the public. It's not only available to the IGS, but it's available to the school teacher that's in high school that wants to do something new with her students, or completely new science in a different area that we've never even thought about. And that's really a good thing that we like to see. And as we can continue to move users over to the HTTP system, I think they're going to get even more information to show that, which really helps us in the long run with funding. I will point out that within the entire NASA as this infrastructure for Earth data, CDDIS has 3 of the top 10 data products. Number 1 is GNSS Daily. Number 6 is the GNSS Tropospheric. And then number 9 is the Broadcast and Ferris. Those all have, as of June 30th of 2021, more than 100 million downloads. And number 1 and number 6 have typically been the largest in the ESDIS infrastructure for the last 3 or 4 years. So that's a really good thing to the community can see just how much that data is actually used out there. Next slide. Country distribution, just a quick slide to look at some of this. We usually touched around 160 to 170 countries per year. Typically 40 or do 99.9% of all the downloads, but really about 10 countries constitute about 97% of all the data. And you can see the biggies in there with China, United States, and then Germany coming up in third. But that's just to give you an idea of where all the data is going and flowing from CDDIS. GNSS growth since 2011. We've been on a pretty much consistent 20% year growth in files, projecting basically 100 million per year in 2023. High rate and hourly are our main drivers, as you'd pretty much expect. I don't think most people understand, but one high rate site can anywhere be from 100,000+ files per year, depending on if it's a RINEX 2 or a RINEX 3 and how many different other formats it has other than, D, N, P, Q, or whatever. Also, the high rate along that is only about 50% of the IGS sites. So if the rest of those sites start to give high rate data, this number is going to become even bigger. We have seen RINEX 2 significantly decreasing this year. As we saw, V4 is going to be coming online again. Pretty soon, we're going to have a position probably where we're going to be like we were with version 2 and version 3. We're going to have data in both formats out there. From an archive perspective, that's not the best. I understand why it's happening, but we would prefer to have data in one format to be able to make it easy enough for those people that are outside the community to understand and use it, instead of saying, well, how come you have version 3 and how come you have version 4? Which one am I supposed to use? And it puts us in the middle of a lot of things. Just a little bit on the growth. You can see the growth there really for our purpose. We're looking at about 80 terabytes of GNSS data by the end of 2021. Just touch on real time. Really, we're pushing about 500 gigabytes of daily transfers. Back in May, we did have a record 15,000 simultaneous connections. Our average latency is running around 1.5 seconds. That's kind of skewed towards the upper end a little bit because of products. Most data is about a second or less. And you can see all the number of data streams that we have there, all the IGS plus all of the exclusive NASA GD GPS availability, and then the entire Chile network plus a few others from other countries. So talk a little bit about upcoming changes and improvements. So 1 December 2021, we're going to enact the high rate data consolidation that the IGS Central Bureau approved here about 1.5 years ago. What that is we're going to take all of the high rate data that's older than 6 months of age and consolidate it all down into one site or monument per day. So instead of having 96 files of one file type per site per day, you're going to have just one file. And we did that for 2 reasons. One is that there is a technical aspect from our perspective to try to reduce the number of files because we run into what's called a small file size problem. Any of you who have ever did a lot of data download from CDDIS in the past would probably see it to where your speed is pretty much limited to somewhere around 5 megs a second. And that's not because of the bandwidth, that's because just of the overhead of opening and finding and doing all the connections and everything that you limit yourself. We've also established a user working group. This is a series of scientists across multiple disciplines that will meet on a regular basis to give insight from their communities to CDDIS and NASA headquarters on policy, work area that they think we need to do, things that are products or services that they would like us to see. And I'm really excited about this. It's going to make a lot of work for us, but I think it's good to have an independent analysis pushed into the perspective of CDDIS and headquarters, especially as it makes some good efforts and arguments for additional funding. One last thing I want to talk about coming up on some here in 22 is that technically right now we have a requirement of any file that comes into the system to be completely quality controlled and made available to the public in 5 minutes. In most cases, that's typically well under 2 minutes, but we've had more than a fair number of requests to have that number down to 30 seconds. So somewhere in 2022, we're going to look at re-architecting some of our infrastructure and make a requirement of 30 seconds with pushing for an acceptance of about 15 seconds for any new file that comes in and being made available to the public. We've opened up a new forum. You can see the HTTPS URL there. That's really a self-help. CDIS puts all of our help desk tickets and other things within that, and it's available to anybody to be able to use it for themselves or to talk to other users to figure out how to do things. It's kind of helpfully to the community to be able to talk about things that they might want to do and try to keep us out of the loop, trying to always figure out and help people. New measures data sets coming in. I think we got 9 new data sets coming in from Jutta Brock. That's you can see, go to there to talk about what all that's coming in. And then one thing that's not technically CDDIS, but which we are involved in, is that NASA does have commercial data buys, specifically GNSS data buys from the Spire GNSS satellites. These are reflectometry and radio occultation data. You can see the URL for that to talk about that. That is not public data. That is data that's available to any US funded researcher. As such, it won't be placed on CDDIS for availability, but it is out there in case people want to look at it or use it. And then finally, I want to talk about cloud activities. I've been kind of vague about that over the while as we've talked, but we are going in the cloud. Probably the first data set's going to be in late 2022 with our DORIS data. They're kind of the smallest, but they're also probably the best for us to get our feet wet in it to make sure we're working. GNSS is not really coming along until 2023 at the latest, as there's a fair amount of lift and shift that has to take place in that. This is somewhere, if there's a lot of interest, I'm more than willing to give another talk and we can talk about that, some of the issues that we've got coming up, things that might change for the community and that type of stuff. But at this point, I think it's kind of early just to talk about it. And then finally, just want to open it up to any questions and say, hey, if there's anything you need to talk to us, please reach out to us. Please use our help desk. It's probably the best way to get a hold of us. That way it makes sure we don't have a single point of failure anywhere. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Pat. That was a really comprehensive and fantastic presentation on the CDDIS databases. And we have 2 questions. So more it's a curiosity from Robert, and I think we share that curiosity in the Central Bureau. Are you still getting FTP requests after service was terminated?
Yes, I didn't really talk about that. You saw a bullet on there about people not really following what their scripts are. We were still getting requests as far as May and early June from occasionally people saying, hey, I'm just realizing that my FTP script hasn't worked for a while. What's going on? How do I get to FTP? And it's like, well, we've turned that off 1 November of last year, so it's not available. Here's the instructions on how to use either FTP, SSL, or HTTPS. So yes, we still occasionally get requests for it.
Okay. A second question, it's more about global accessibility. Is there any region that in which they might experience any like blockages or based on IP access or maybe slowdowns?
No, as a DAC, we are chartered for public consumption of all public data. So that means we do not block anybody that wishes to download any of our data. So if they're coming from China, they can get data. As you saw, that's one of the largest out there to grab data from it. There are some restrictions on who can upload data to us, but that is completely different from actually accessing our data from anywhere in the world. If there's any issues, it's not from us. It's from either the country they're in or something that's technical in place. We do not block anybody to grab data from us on a download basis.
Okay. One more question from Frank. How does CDDIS synchronize or coordinate data holdings with respect to GNSS with other data centers?
Okay, this question comes up occasionally. For somewhere along the line, there's been this thought that the data centers have this automatic sync process. Since I've been with CDDIS, there's never been a formal process that automatically syncs data. And it becomes a much more harder problem than you think when with all the different data centers that you have and how they work. What we try to do in the case of like IGN or BKG is that we know what data they're getting, and it might not necessarily be coming to us. So we make sure that we go out and we grab it. But there's never been anything written that the data centers are supposed to have a synchronizing process between all of them. It's something we've talked about. It's not necessarily an easy problem, especially when you start talking, 400 million files between us and another data center doesn't have the ability to even do that much. There's just going to be a lot of problems, and it's not an easy problem necessarily to solve.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and the answers to the questions that we had.